Carlos, movie review. So this is a combined French-German production. The true story about the real-life terrorist Carlos the Jackal. I've called it a movie review just now, but I should note that it's a little bit ambiguous whether this is actually a movie or a miniseries. Actually, it's probably a miniseries. It's 5.5 hours long. According to Wikipedia, it was originally screened on French TV in 3 parts. Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3 on 3 separate nights, just like a miniseries. But, also according to Wikipedia, they also screened it as a film. Like all 5.5 hours of it were shown apparently at once at the Cannes Film Festival in 2010. I stumbled across this DVD in Cambodia when I was living at Cambodia. If those of you who have been to Cambodia or have lived in Cambodia will know at the riverside in Phnom Penh, there's all sorts of very cheap illegal DVDs that everyone buys, which is where I stumbled upon it, and it was marketed in the casing as a movie. So I'm tending to think of it as a movie, but it is 5.5 hours long, and probably maybe it's a mini-series. The copy I had was not broken up into parts, but obviously I did not watch the 5.5 hours all in one go. I just, on my own initiative, when I got sick of watching it, hit the pause button, and I watched it over the course of 3 days myself, even though the DVD copy I had was all together like one long movie. Anyways, let me back up briefly and talk about the historical figure that this is based on, Carlos the Jackal. Actually, I say historical figure, but he's still alive now. He's in prison for the rest of his life, but he's still alive. I remember when he got caught. It was big news at the time. It was 1994. I was 15 years old at the time, and you know, this was back in the days when you still read the news on newspaper. So I was going through the evening newspaper, and there was, you know, the big headline, Carlos the Jackal caught. Finally, we got him. And I thought, who in the world is Carlos the Jackal, and why is everybody talking about him like it's this big deal? And I think actually this is this phenomenon that when you're in your teens and when you're just beginning to take an interest in the adult world and take an interest in the news, it's a little bit hard to enter the news because the news is not written for teenagers. The news is written for like people in their 40s who remember 20 years ago when Carlos the Jackal was active. Just as if you were to pick up a newspaper now and you were to read the news stories, anything that happened 20 years ago, you know, like the George W. Bush years, they wouldn't talk about it like it was completely new to you and you needed all the details. They would maybe assume most of the readership was familiar with it. I think this was what was going on here. 1994 was about 20 years almost exactly after Carlos the Jackal's exploits. So I think they were just presuming that their readers were familiar with it. But I had no idea who this guy was. But you know, what a strange name, Carlos the Jackal, who was a notorious terrorist who had done something infamous. And it was all just very mysterious to me. Few years later, when I was in college, I found a website. It was on, I think, it was a true TV crime website affiliated with some sort of true crime documentaries that were on a cable network or something like that. And they had the biographies of all these notorious true criminals. And they had a long multi-part biography of Carlos the Jackal. Multi-part meaning one of those things where you get to the end of the page and then you have to click to send me to the next page. It's an old site. I read it all the way back in the late 90s. It's still accessible on the internet via the Internet Archive. You can access it from there. I will leave a link down below for anyone who's interested. I found it just fascinating reading myself. I went from really having very little idea of what this guy actually did to feeling like this multi-part, rather in-depth article gave me a very thorough grounding in who Carlos the Jackal was and why he was famous and what he did. And as I was reading through this, I just found it fascinating. And again, I'll link to it down below. It was like something out of a movie. All the, you know, escapes he was in, and all the shootouts and the explosions, and he was notorious for a number of things back in the 70s. It wasn't just kind of like one terrorist act he was in. He was either in on or part of a number of different things, and had a number of different run-ins with the police and escapes from them. And as I was reading it, I was thinking to myself, this should be a movie. And I think part of that was I was watching a ton of movies back in those days, and I don't know if anyone else can identify with this. When you watch a ton of movies, you start to think about everything in cinematic terms. You know, like every time you're reading a book, you think to yourself, okay, now how would they do this as a movie? Or like every time you're reading an incident from history, you start to imagine it as like a movie. I think I was in that zone. So I was reading this and I was thinking, this could make a really great movie. I was young then and very stupid. Now that I'm older and more mature and a little bit wiser, I think, no, it would make a terrible movie. I mean, sure, there are these dramatic escapes, and sure, there are these gunfire battles and these explosions and stuff like that, but there's no sympathetic character. I mean, Carlos the Jackal was a completely reprehensible human being, and if you're going to get the audience sucked into a movie about him where, you know, they've got to kind of sit there for 2 hours or 5.5 hours, then you've got to give the audience something to root for. You can't just say, okay, here's a reprehensible man and we're going to show you everything reprehensible he did for 2 hours or 5.5 hours. Anyways, I thought it was quite interesting at the time. And so then years later, when I was in Cambodia, and I stumbled across this DVD, and I thought, oh, they actually did make a movie out of his life. I decided to check it out. Now, sorry, I've been rambling for quite a bit, and I haven't really given much background on him. So, Carlos the Jackal was part of the terrorist scene in the 1970s. Now, in the 1970s, there was a scene which really no longer exists today. But you had these groups which had been radicalized during the student protests of the late 1960s, particularly in Europe, particularly in West Germany, and also, funnily enough, in Japan. Sorry, I know Japan's not in Europe, but you had the Japanese student movement, which ended up creating the Japanese Red Army, which was a terrorist group that grew out of the Japanese student movement. And then you had multiple groups which grew out of the West German student movement. And these groups had been, among other things, galvanized by the Vietnam War. But then when the Vietnam War faded and ended during the late 70s and mid-70s, you had these groups that were left over and looking for a cause, and they aligned themselves with the Palestinian cause, so fighting for the freedom of the Palestinian people. At least that's the way it's traditionally been told, that story. I'm sure I'm oversimplifying it a bit, and somebody, you know, let me know in the comments if you have better insight into this than I do. But you had the Japanese Red Army and some of these West German terrorist groups who aligned themselves with Islamic radicals, which is a very strange alliance, obviously. But you know, that's the these godless atheist communists with these radical religious zealots. But that was the alliance at the time. And so the Palestinian terrorists in the 1970s were allied with the West German communists and the Japanese Red Army. Carlos the Jackal was from Venezuela. But he had come over to Europe and he had gotten himself plugged into that scene. He had come from a leftist family, but it's interesting when you read about Carlos the Jackal, you never really, at least the articles I was reading, you never really seem to read about his deep commitment to Marxist theory, even though that I think that was his background. In fact, when you read about any of these terrorist groups, even though they do come out of the New Left movement in the 1960s, when you read about what they're doing, it actually seems removed from ideology. In other words, even though these groups did come out of that movement, Carlos the Jackal, when you read anything about him, you get the impression that he was motivated purely by ego, and that idealism didn't seem to play a big part in it. I have a pet theory, and this is just my pet theory. Actually, sorry, I shouldn't say it's just my pet theory. Other people have come to the same conclusion, but it's something I offer here without any kind of evidence to back it up, but just as something that sounds logical to me. That when these groups become engaged in terrorism, very soon the ideology gets lost, and just kind of survival or the terrorism itself becomes the ideology. I think that seems to have been true of the anarchist terrorists back in the 1910s and the 1890s, and I think it looks like it was true of the leftist terrorists in the 1970s, is even though they came out of the leftist movement, when you actually kind of read the stories of the hijackings they were involved in and stuff like that, it seems like they were just kind of, it seems like almost this gang thug mentality took over. But that being said, Carlos the Jackal was aligned with a number of these groups, with kind of the leftist Islamic Radical Alliance in the 70s, and participated in a number of the acts. Okay, so with that as background, let me jump into the movie review here. Now, I know I said previously, like previously being just a few minutes ago, that now that I'm older, I don't think that a successful movie about Carlos the Jackal can be made, but this comes really close. This was an absolutely fascinating movie. It's purely for history nerds. I'm counting the 1970s as history here. If you're not interested in history or politics, it's probably going to be a very long 5.5 hours for you. I wouldn't recommend it. I mean, sure, there are explosions, there are gunfights, but there's also a lot of politics here. There are a lot of shifting alliances, and there's a lot of kind of behind-the-scenes politicking, because the Soviet Union and some of the other communist countries were kind of supporting some of these groups, but kind of not, and kind of hiding behind the scenes, and it all gets a little bit complicated. And if you're a history or political nerd like I am, you'll find this fascinating, and the movie does get into this. If you're not interested in history, if you're not interested in politics, stay far away from this movie. But yeah, if you're a history nerd, it's fascinating. Although the focus of this movie is only on one man, the story of Carlos's life, through this story we get a glimpse into several of the terrorist groups of the 1970s and how interrelated they were. It's a long movie at 5.5 hours long. I would not recommend watching it all in one sitting. However, I broke it up into 3 days and I found it a fantastic viewing experience. The length of the movie allows the filmmakers to fully flesh out the events without having to rush through anything. Now, the challenge of making a movie about the life of Carlos the Jackal is that the filmmakers have to make him charismatic and interesting enough to hold the attention of the audience, but they don't want to glorify him. This film does a remarkably good job of walking that line. They attempt to explain Carlos's motivations and show how he viewed what he was doing against the backdrop of counter-revolutionary terror that was occurring across South America at the time. So even though his theater of operations was in Europe and the Middle East, Carlos was from Venezuela, and the 1970s were a time when these terrorist right-wing governments were taking over many countries in Latin America, and the time when all the leftists and labor union leaders were disappearing in Latin America. And there's a scene when Carlos is referencing what's going on in Latin America, and he's using that as a reason to justify what he's doing in Europe. So I thought that was interesting. But at the same time, the filmmakers do not glorify Carlos. They show him as having a callous attitude towards human life that borders on psychopathic. And in his relationships with women, they portray him as controlling and sometimes sadistic. I would highly recommend this movie/miniseries to any history nerds who happen to be watching this. I have a few other random thoughts about some of the issues in this movie, which I'll go through in no particular order. I mentioned earlier that primarily allied with the Arab groups were former student radicals from West Germany and from Japan, the German revolutionary cells and the Japanese Red Army. It's interesting that the student movements in both West Germany and Japan got very intense and very violent near the end of the 1960s and produced these splinter terrorist groups. I want to be careful here not to equate the student movement in West Germany and Japan with the terrorist organizations that grew out of it, because it was only just kind of a small minority, a few crazies who went on to form these terrorist groups. It was not indicative of the much larger student movement in West Germany and Japan. But it was true that in both West Germany and Japan, the student movement was very intense and very violent. And I've read some people make a comparison. They said the 1968 generation in both Germany, West Germany and Japan, this was one generation removed from fascism. So, the people who were teenagers or who were in college in 1968 in West Germany and in Japan, their parents had been the Nazis, or, their parents had been the fascists in Japan. And because they were so horrified by what their parents had done, but partly horrified by what their parents had done, and also partly terrified that the fascists could come back into power. I think this was maybe especially true in Japan, that some of these old guard fascists had been rehabilitated under the name of anti-communism and were beginning to creep back into government. That resulted in this intense reaction. So it was no coincidence that these intense student movements came out of both West Germany and Japan. And yeah, both of them ended up spinning off some terrorist organizations which ended up aligning themselves with the Palestinian cause. The Japanese Red Army operated for a time out of Paris. They actually blended in with all the Japanese tourists who would go to Paris. So they just pretend to be Japanese tourists and they would blend in that way. They were actually given a prominent part in the beginning of this miniseries when they worked with Carlos the Jackal to take over the French embassy in The Hague in 1972. German radicals also play a big part in this movie. Now, one of the big ironies of history is it's been theorized that one of the reasons that the German student movement was so intense was because of the horror of what their parents had done, the Nazi generation. They did not want the Nazis to come back. They wanted to distinguish themselves from their parents. But because they ended up allying themselves with the pro-Palestinian cause, it became anti-Zionist. And then anti-Zionist has a weird way of sometimes becoming anti-Jew. Logically, there should be a clear division between support of Zionism and, support of everyday Jews. But unfortunately, it does seem like this often can get confused, and this got a bit confused. So you have this almost going full circle where these young German radicals who have been so appalled by what their parents had done come full circle to where now they are taking anti-Jew measures. And this is hit on in the movie. There was a famous incident which is not actually shown in the movie. It's referenced in the movie, but it's not shown in the movie, where German terrorists hijack a French plane and they separate out the Jews from the rest of the passengers, saying, okay, all the Jews go over here, all the rest of the passengers go over here. This is because of their anti-Zionist politics. And one of the Jews shows one of the German terrorists a tattoo that shows he had been in Auschwitz. And the German terrorist, whose name is Bozy, apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong, said to him, "I'm not a Nazi, I'm an idealist." So you can see the irony here, right? There's a Jew who's being separated out by Germans who had survived Auschwitz. And he goes to show his tattoo, and the guy says, "I'm not a Nazi, I'm an idealist." So there was another German radical. His name was Hans Joachim Klein. Again, apologies if I'm mispronouncing this. I'll leave the names and maybe Wikipedia links in the description down below. He was so appalled by what had happened there in that plane, where Germans were separating out the Jews, that he left the movement because of that. And that scene is in the movie. So he had been a former comrade of Carlos the Jackal. But then he said, Bozy separated out the Jews just like at Auschwitz. "I never thought a German of my generation could have done that," he exclaims. And this was in the movie. So I thought that was an interesting spotlight on one of history's ironies that they included in the movie. Okay, and another point here. I also thought this film was fascinating because of the look into international politics of the 1970s. It takes place during a time when the communist bloc was loosely allied with Arab nationalism. And the film hints at backroom deals that went on between the governments of these three countries. We get glimpses into the relationships that the KGB and the East German Stasi and the Hungarian government's relationship with Moscow. Arab leaders who had been in the news recently, or at least were in the news in 2010 when this movie came out, like Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein, also play a prominent part in this movie. Okay, some minor quibbles here. Minor quibble number one. This is a French-German film, and it takes place all over the globe with a cast of international characters. So all kinds of languages are being spoken. There's French, there's German, Japanese, Spanish, Russian, etc. So, if you don't like reading subtitles, you're out of luck. Lots of subtitles in this movie, but that being said, the parts that were hardest for me to follow were the parts that were in English. And I don't know, maybe it was the poor quality of the DVD I got in Cambodia, which was a pirated DVD. Or it may just have been on the original film. So somebody, if you've seen this film, let me know what you thought. I really had a hard time hearing what they were saying in English. I thought the volume was way too low. Possibly it was a poor quality of my DVD, but possibly it was because this film had been made for a French-German market and they were planning on subtitling the English anyways. A lot of this film is actually in English. Whenever two characters from different nationalities converse, they speak in English. I guess because English is the lingua franca these days. Several of the actors were not native English speakers because, again, this is a film about a lot of different nationalities. And it showed. Their pronunciation was usually fine, but there was something a little bit off about their delivery. I think they weren't able to portray natural English. Either that or maybe there was just some bad acting going on. I don't know, one or the other. Okay, minor quibble number 2. The shootout scenes in this movie were very hard for me to follow as far as like what's going on, who's shooting where, who got shot when, all that kind of stuff. I'm not sure if it was intentional or not. Maybe it was a stylistic choice. But the camera was moving too fast for me. And sometimes I felt like I couldn't tell what was going on until the action was finished and then there were the dead bodies on the floor. And then I'm like, okay, those are the people who got shot. I couldn't actually follow it during the actual shootout. Okay, minor quibble or maybe minor note number 3. The soundtrack on this movie was not what I was expecting. I have the feeling that if this had been an American production, a Hollywood production, they would have put in a lot of more dramatic music. Maybe this is just a difference between French and American movie styles. I don't know. But I found myself thinking a lot of times that this scene is really dramatic, but there's no soundtrack. Like, I don't know. I guess I was expecting more of a dramatic soundtrack. There were a few times when they did have music and it didn't seem to fit the mood of the scene very well. And there was even one instance when I think the music got cut off very abruptly. I don't know, maybe it was the quality of the DVD again or something like that. But I just got the impression, well, I don't know, maybe it was my DVD. Or maybe it wasn't. And if it wasn't, then I got the impression that the music didn't seem to match the scenes as well as it could have. All of those minor quibbles aside, though, I found this movie fascinating, and if you're a history nerd, you should find it fascinating as well.